I'm on the wheel. Out of the car now. Hands off me. Out right now. Hey, ow. All right. Step out. Hands where I can see them. Against the car. Don't move. Crazy. I didn't do anything. Keep your hands flat. You're making a mistake. Stay still, sir. I'm not going anywhere. Hands behind your back.
The dashboard camera activated at 3:47 in the afternoon, its tiny red light blinking steadily as it began recording another shift in the life of Officer Kevin Trent. He had been on patrol for nearly 3 hours when he noticed the dark gray Mercedes sedan approaching the intersection of Birchwood Lane and Kensington Drive. This was Sterling Heights, one of those suburbs where the property values started in the high six figures and climbed aggressively from there. The kind of neighborhood where landscaping crews arrived in coordinated uniforms and security companies posted discreet signs on every third lawn. The Mercedes slowed at the four-way stop, paused for the requisite 3 seconds, and proceeded through the intersection with textbook precision. There was nothing wrong with the maneuver, no rolling stop, no failure to signal, no speed that exceeded the residential limit by even a single mile per hour. The car moved like it belonged there, which by every objective measure it did. But something in the back of Kevin Trent's mind began to hum with a frequency he had learned not to ignore. He watched the sedan continue down Birchwood Lane for another 100 yards before he made his decision. His foot came off the accelerator and pressed gently on the brake. His hands moved to the steering wheel, guiding the cruiser into a smooth U-turn that felt as natural as breathing. Years of patrol work had honed certain instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him that something about this picture didn't fit. He keyed his radio with practiced efficiency. "Dispatch, this is Unit 17. I'm initiating a traffic stop on a gray Mercedes sedan heading eastbound on Birchwood approaching Devonshire. Suspicious lane change observed." The justification came out automatically, though even as he said it, Trent knew it was thin. The lane change had been perfectly legal. But he needed something for the record, some verbal hook to hang the stop on, and that was the best he could manufacture in the moment. His cruiser pulled up behind the Mercedes and lit up. No sirens, just the alternating flash of red and blue lights that painted the surrounding brick facades and wrought iron gates in strobing primary colors. The afternoon sun hung low enough to cast long shadows across the immaculate lawns, and somewhere in the distance, a sprinkler system clicked through its automated cycle. The Mercedes responded exactly as it should. The driver activated the right turn signal, guided the vehicle to the curb with careful precision, and brought it to a complete stop. Everything about the maneuver communicated compliance, cooperation, awareness of the unwritten rules that govern these interactions. Inside that Mercedes, a man named Jerome Caldwell was processing what was happening with the kind of weary familiarity that came from having lived this scenario before. He was 43 years old, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that still held its press, despite a full day of meetings at the downtown consulting firm where he worked. His hands moved to the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and they stayed there, absolutely still, as if any sudden movement might trigger a chain of events he had spent his entire adult life trying to avoid. The window came down slowly, not too fast, nothing that could be interpreted as aggressive or impatient. Just a smooth descent of glass that let in the afternoon air, along with the distant sound of that clicking sprinkler. Jerome's eyes faced forward, locked on a point somewhere beyond his own windshield, deliberately avoiding the rearview mirror where he could already see the officer's silhouette approaching. If you've been watching stories like this one for any length of time, you probably already think you know what happens next. A black man in an expensive car. A white cop in an upscale neighborhood. A traffic stop that shouldn't be happening but is. The pattern is so familiar that it almost tells itself, and right now, watching this scene unfold, you might feel like you already know every beat, every escalation, every predictable outcome. But this story is going to take a turn that nobody saw coming. Not Jerome, not Officer Trent, not the neighbors who would soon start filming, and definitely not the millions of people who would eventually watch a 90-second clip and believe they understood everything that happened here. So if you're planning to watch this to the end, you might want to settle in, because what started as a routine traffic stop is about to unravel something far darker than anyone imagined. Officer Kevin Trent approached the Mercedes like a man expecting conflict. His posture was rigid, shoulders squared, weight balanced on the balls of his feet. One hand rested on his duty belt, fingers close enough to the holster that the message was clear without being explicit. His other hand held his flashlight, even though the afternoon sun made it completely unnecessary. The body camera on his chest captured everything. The angle of his approach, the tension in his stride, the way his eyes swept the vehicle's interior before he had even reached the driver's window. These were the habits of a man who had been trained to treat every stop as a potential threat. But they were also the habits of a man who had already made certain assumptions about who he was dealing with and why. License and registration. The words came out clipped, professional but cold. No greeting, no explanation for the stop, just the demand. Jerome Caldwell responded without turning his head. His voice was measured, careful, pitched at exactly the tone that conveyed respect without submission. "Of course, officer. My license is in my wallet, which is in my jacket pocket. My registration is in the glove compartment. May I reach for them?" It was a script Jerome had learned years ago, during one of those conversations that black parents have with their children and white parents rarely need to consider. The talk, some people called it. The detailed instruction manual for how to survive an encounter with law enforcement when your skin color made you automatically suspect. Trent nodded once but said nothing. The silence hung between them like humidity, thick and uncomfortable. Jerome moved his right hand slowly toward his jacket pocket, hyper-aware that any movement could be misinterpreted, that the margin for error in these situations was razor-thin. He extracted his wallet with surgical precision, removed his driver's license, and extended it toward the window with his left hand, while keeping his right hand visible and motionless on the steering wheel. The same careful choreography repeated for the registration, a slow reach toward the glove compartment, a deliberate pause before opening it, the retrieval of documents that were exactly where they should be, filed neatly in a leather folio that spoke to a life of meticulous organization. Trent examined the documents longer than necessary. His eyes moved from the license to Jerome's face and back again, as if searching for some discrepancy that would justify the suspicion he clearly felt. The license was valid, the registration was current, the name on both documents matched, and the address listed was less than 2 miles from this very spot. But Trent didn't hand the documents back. Instead, he let his gaze wander through the vehicle's interior, scanning the passenger seat, the back seat, the floor mats. The body camera recorded every second of this inventory, documenting a search that was happening through eyes rather than hands, but carrying the same invasive weight. "Hang on a minute," Trent muttered. Though there was no reason given, no explanation offered, he walked back toward his cruiser with Jerome's documents in hand, leaving the driver to sit in a silence that stretched like taffy under summer heat. Inside the Mercedes, Jerome Caldwell processed this moment the way he had processed dozens of similar moments throughout his life. The initial flash of anger that he had learned to suppress, the deeper weariness that came from knowing this would happen again. Somewhere, sometime, for reasons that had nothing to do with his driving and everything to do with his existence in spaces that certain people still believed he didn't belong. He thought about his daughter, 12 years old now, and how he would eventually have to give her the same talk his father had given him. He thought about his wife, who would ask him later how his day was, and whether he would tell her about this, or simply add it to the silent catalog of indignities he carried. He thought about the house they had purchased in this neighborhood 3 years ago, the house they had earned through hard work and professional success, and how none of that seemed to matter when a cop decided you looked out of place. 3 minutes passed, then 5, then 7. Through his side mirror, Jerome could see Trent sitting in the cruiser, doing something with the computer mounted to his dashboard, running his information presumably, checking for warrants that didn't exist, searching for a reason to justify what was already happening. When Trent finally returned to the window, his posture had shifted. There was something different in his eyes, a kind of searching intensity that went beyond standard procedure. He handed back the license and registration, but his other hand remained planted on the doorframe, claiming territory, establishing control. "What brings you to this neighborhood today?" The question landed like a slap, though its violence was entirely in its implication. Not "where are you headed?" or "is this your residence?" But "what brings you here?" as if Jerome's presence required explanation, as if the default assumption was that he was a visitor in a place where he didn't belong. Jerome blinked once, a microsecond of reaction that he quickly controlled. "I'm driving home from work," he said evenly. "I live on Devonshire Court, about 1.5 miles that way." He tilted his head slightly in the direction of his house, careful not to move his hands from the steering wheel. Trent didn't acknowledge the answer. Instead, he pressed forward with another question. Have you been drinking today? No, sir. Any drugs in the vehicle? No, sir. Do you mind if I take a look around? And there it was. The question that separated routine harassment from something more serious. Jerome felt his pulse quicken, though he worked to keep his voice steady. He knew his rights. He had studied them, memorized them, prepared for exactly this moment. But knowing your rights and exercising them were two very different things when a man with a badge and a gun was standing at your window. Actually, yes, Jerome said, the words coming out calm and clear. I do mind. I don't consent to a search. The effect was immediate. Trent's face tightened, his jaw setting in a way that communicated displeasure more effectively than any words could have. The body camera captured the transformation, the way his professional detachment curdled into something that looked very much like offense. You sure about that? Jerome nodded once. Yes, officer, I know my rights. What happened next would be analyzed, debated, and dissected by millions of people in the days to come. But in this moment, standing on a quiet suburban street with the afternoon sun warming his back and the distant sprinkler still clicking through its cycle, Kevin Trent made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. He took a step back from the window, his head tilted slightly to one side, a theatrical gesture that seemed almost rehearsed, and then he said the words that transformed everything. I smell something. Step out of the vehicle. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in a tone that left no room for negotiation. And Jerome Caldwell, who had spent 43 years learning how to navigate these situations, understood immediately what was happening. The claim of smelling something was a justification, a verbal get-out-of-jail-free card that officers had used for decades to manufacture probable cause where none existed. Jerome turned off the engine. He unbuckled his seatbelt with deliberate slowness. He opened the door and stepped out onto the asphalt, his hands visible, his movements telegraphed, every action designed to communicate compliance, even as his mind raced with the injustice of what was being done to him. I'm recording this, he said, holding up his phone. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, a determination that hadn't been there before. The camera app was already running, its lens pointed at Officer Trent, documenting what the body camera was already capturing from a different angle. The dynamics of the encounter shifted in that moment. Jerome wasn't just a suspect now. He was a witness, an archivist, a man creating his own record of what was happening to him. And Kevin Trent, who had initiated this stop based on nothing more than a feeling that something was off, found himself suddenly aware of an audience he hadn't anticipated. Across the street, a woman had emerged from her front door. Her name was Patricia Nguyen, and she had lived in Sterling Heights for 15 years, long enough to know that traffic stops in this neighborhood were rare and usually involved teenagers caught with beer in their back seats. This was different. She could see that immediately. A black man in a suit standing beside an expensive car, hands raised, phone pointed at a white police officer whose posture radiated hostility. Patricia reached for her own phone. Her fingers found the camera app almost automatically, muscle memory born from years of watching similar videos proliferate across social media. She began recording from her porch, 50 feet away, her lens capturing a wide shot of the scene that would later become one of the most shared clips of the year. A teenager on a bicycle had stopped at the corner. He straddled his frame, one foot planted on the curb, watching with the kind of rapt attention that suggested he understood the significance of what he was seeing. 3 doors down, an elderly man had stepped onto his lawn, ostensibly to check his mailbox, but clearly more interested in the flashing lights than in whatever bills might be waiting for him. Kevin Trent felt the weight of these eyes on him, and it changed something in his demeanor. He didn't like being watched. Didn't like the accountability that came with knowing his actions were being documented from multiple angles. His voice grew sharper, his commands more clipped. Back away from the vehicle, he barked at Jerome. Hands where I can see them. Jerome complied, stepping backward until his shoulders nearly touched the neighbor's manicured hedge. His phone remained raised, still recording, a small act of resistance in a situation where most forms of resistance had been stripped away. You said you smelled something, Jerome said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet afternoon air. What exactly do you think is in my car? Trent didn't answer. Instead, he keyed his radio and spoke loudly enough for the recording to pick up every word. Dispatch, this is Unit 17. I have a non-compliant suspect at my location refusing a lawful search, requesting backup. The lie was breathtaking in its casualness. Jerome had not refused a lawful search because there was no lawful search to refuse. He had declined to consent, which was his constitutional right. But Trent's words were already creating a different narrative, one where Jerome was the problem, where his assertion of rights was transformed into evidence of guilt. "I'm not resisting," Jerome said clearly, speaking as much to the cameras as to the officer. "I've cooperated fully with everything you've asked me to do." More neighbors had gathered now. Patricia Nguyen had moved from her porch to the edge of her lawn, still filming. A man in running shorts had jogged up and stopped, his earbuds dangling around his neck as he watched with undisguised concern. The clicking sprinkler had finally fallen silent, and in the stillness, every word, every movement seemed amplified. This is the part of the story where you probably think you know what happens next. The confrontation escalates. The recording goes viral. The internet discovers another example of racial profiling, another case of a black man harassed for existing in the wrong zip code. The hashtags write themselves. The outrage machine kicks into gear. Justice, or something that looks like it from a distance, eventually arrives. But what you don't know, what nobody watching in that moment could possibly know, is that everything they thought they were seeing was about to be turned completely inside out. Because the backup unit hadn't arrived yet, but Officer Kevin Trent wasn't going to wait for it. And what he was about to find in the trunk of that Mercedes would transform this story into something nobody was prepared for. Let me know in the comments if you've ever witnessed a moment like this, when you thought you understood exactly what was happening, only to have the whole picture shatter into something completely different. Because this story isn't about what it appears to be. Not even close. The second cruiser was still 3 minutes away when Kevin Trent made his move. He walked to the driver's side door of the Mercedes, placed his hand on the handle, and pulled it open. No warrant, no consent, no probable cause beyond a claim of smelling something that he had almost certainly fabricated. Just a badge and the belief that the rules didn't apply to him in this moment. "You can't do that." Jerome's voice rose for the first time, crossing from measured calm into something that bordered on alarm. "I told you I don't consent to a search. You have no right to go through my car." Trent didn't respond. He didn't even turn around. His body camera captured everything with mechanical indifference as he leaned into the vehicle, opened the center console, rifled through the contents. He found a phone charger, a pack of mints. Nothing. To the growing crowd of witnesses, this was confirmation of everything they had suspected. Patricia Nguyen's hands trembled slightly as she continued filming, her internal monologue racing through every video she had seen before this one, every story that had followed the same devastating pattern. The teenager on the bicycle had pulled out his own phone now, adding another angle to the growing archive of documentation. Kevin Trent moved to the back of the vehicle. His hand found the trunk release, and the lid popped open with a soft hydraulic hiss. What he expected to find, he couldn't have said with any precision. Maybe nothing. Maybe something minor enough to justify writing a ticket and moving on with his day. He was operating on pure instinct now, the kind of instinct that had served him well in some situations and led him badly astray in others. The trunk was neat and organized, which was consistent with everything else about this vehicle and its driver. A gym bag sat in one corner, its contents unremarkable. A reusable shopping bag from a high-end grocery store. A small emergency kit of the type that safety-conscious drivers kept for roadside breakdowns. And then there was the duffel bag. It was black, nondescript, the kind of bag you could buy at any sporting goods store for $30. But something about its placement made Trent pause. It sat at the center of the trunk space, positioned with a deliberateness that seemed at odds with the casual organization of everything around it. He reached for the zipper, pulled it open, and felt his breath catch in his throat. Inside the duffel bag was a hard-sided case, the kind used for transporting sensitive equipment. Stamped on its surface in faded official lettering were the words "Property of Federal Bureau of Investigation." The seal on the case was intact, but its presence here, in the trunk of a car driven by a man he had stopped for essentially no reason, was wrong in ways that Trent couldn't immediately articulate. Next to the case was a pouch containing several USB drives. Their surfaces were unmarked, but their number and organization suggested significance. Tucked into one of the side pockets were manila folders bound with rubber bands, their labels visible but cryptic. First names followed by dates. Marcus, March 15th. Destiny, July 22nd. Tyler, November 3rd. The handwriting was precise, almost clinical. Trent's hand moved deeper into the bag. His fingers closed around a small plastic sleeve, and when he pulled it into the light, what he saw made his blood run cold. 4 driver's licenses, each from a different state: Ohio, Nevada, Georgia, Texas, each with different names and different addresses. But every single one bore the same photograph, the same face that belonged to the man standing 30 feet away with his hands raised and his phone recording. The body camera captured the change in Kevin Trent's breathing. The audio picked up the shortened inhales, the quickened rhythm of a man whose instincts had just collided with reality in a way he hadn't anticipated. Whatever he had expected to find when he started this search, whatever half-formed suspicion had driven him to violate this man's rights, it wasn't this. He looked back at Jerome Caldwell, who stood motionless at the edge of the road, his expression unreadable from this distance. The man who had been calm throughout the entire encounter. The man who had known his rights and asserted them clearly. The man who had done everything right, said everything right, performed compliance with a fluency that spoke to years of practice. That calm suddenly looked different. It wasn't the composure of an innocent man dealing with injustice. It was the stillness of someone who had been through situations like this before and knew exactly how to manage them. Trent's voice dropped to barely above a whisper when he keyed his radio again. "Dispatch, this is Unit 17. I need a supervisor at my location immediately. Priority." The energy of the scene had shifted in ways that the watching neighbors couldn't quite parse. Patricia Nguyen kept filming, but something in Officer Trent's body language had changed. The aggression was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. The teenager on the bicycle exchanged a glance with the jogger in the running shorts. Something was happening that didn't fit the expected script. The backup unit arrived less than 2 minutes later. Sergeant Amanda Reeves stepped out of her cruiser and read the situation immediately. Trent's face told her something was wrong before he said a single word. She approached him at the rear of the Mercedes, positioned her body so that her own camera would capture whatever was in that trunk, and listened as Trent explained what he had found. Her response was succinct and profane, a single word that captured the magnitude of what she was seeing. She reached for the manila folders herself, opened the first one, and understood immediately that this traffic stop had just become something else entirely. Inside the folder were photographs, not vacation snapshots or family portraits. These were surveillance images of young people, some who looked to be in their early teens. Accompanying each photo were notes in cramped handwriting, physical descriptions, schedule information, online usernames. The second folder contained printouts of digital conversations, social media exchanges that began innocuously and escalated with predatory precision. The language was grooming language, the kind of calculated manipulation that law enforcement officers learn to recognize in specialized training courses. Amanda Reeves closed the folder slowly, like a person handling evidence at a crime scene, which she now realized she was. Her gaze moved to Jerome Caldwell, still standing at the roadside, still holding his phone, still projecting that unsettling calm that had now taken on an entirely different meaning. "Where did you find this?" she asked Trent, her voice low enough that the bystanders couldn't hear. "The trunk. I searched the car." "Did he consent?" "No." The word hung between them, laden with implications that both of them understood. Kevin Trent had conducted an illegal search. He had violated this man's constitutional rights based on nothing more than racial profiling and a fabricated claim of smelling something suspicious. Under normal circumstances, anything found in that search would be inadmissible. Fruit of the poisonous tree, defense attorneys called it. Evidence obtained through illegal means, tainted beyond use. But the evidence in that trunk wasn't about a personal use quantity of marijuana or an unregistered handgun. It was something else entirely, something that made the legal technicalities feel almost obscene in their inadequacy. Jerome Caldwell watched from his position at the roadside. His phone was still recording, but his expression had shifted almost imperceptibly. The performance of victimhood that had been so convincing minutes earlier had given way to something harder, more calculating. He had been through situations like this before, and he had always emerged intact. Always. This time felt different. Sergeant Reeves approached him with a measured stride that communicated nothing about what she had just seen. Her voice was professional, carefully neutral. "Sir, we're going to need to detain you for questioning. You're not under arrest at this time, but we need to secure the evidence in your vehicle." Jerome didn't protest, didn't demand to know what evidence she was talking about, didn't invoke his rights again, or threaten legal action. He simply slipped his phone into his pocket, turned around, and placed his hands behind his back with a fluidity that suggested this wasn't his first time wearing handcuffs. The cuffs clicked shut with a sound that carried across the quiet street. Patricia Nguyen lowered her phone for the first time, confusion evident on her face. The narrative she thought she had been documenting had suddenly stopped making sense. Why wasn't he arguing? Why wasn't he demanding a lawyer? Why was the officer who had conducted the clearly illegal search now standing off to the side, looking like a man who had just witnessed a car accident? One of the other neighbors called out, "What's going on? Why are you arresting him?" Nobody answered. The silence that followed was loaded with questions that wouldn't be answered for days. Questions that would eventually transform this story from a simple case of racial profiling into something that would shake people's assumptions about victims and perpetrators, about instincts and evidence, about the stories we tell ourselves when we think we understand what we're seeing. In the back of Sergeant Reeves's cruiser, Jerome Caldwell sat with his eyes fixed forward and his face completely empty of expression. Whatever he was thinking in that moment, he kept it to himself. He had been in worse situations. He had always found a way out, but the contents of that duffel bag were already being photographed, cataloged, and uploaded to databases that would flag his name in ways that no legal name change could undo. And the body cameras worn by both officers had captured everything, including his calm, his cooperation, his complete lack of surprise when told he was being detained. The game had changed. He just didn't know yet how badly he had lost. The precinct's interrogation room was small and aggressively lit, the kind of fluorescent brightness that stripped away shadows and made everyone look vaguely ill. Jerome Caldwell sat at the metal table with his hands folded in front of him, a posture of studied relaxation that contrasted sharply with the circumstances. He had declined legal representation for the initial interview, a decision that might have seemed confident or might have seemed foolish, depending on how the next few hours unfolded. Sergeant Reeves sat across from him, a tablet displaying Jerome's information lying flat on the table between them. The initial database search had come back clean. Jerome Marcus Caldwell, born March 17, 1981. No outstanding warrants, no criminal record visible through standard channels. The license was valid. The registration was current. Everything matched. Everything checked out. And yet, "Tell me about the duffel bag in your trunk," Reeves said, her voice carrying the professional flatness of someone who had conducted hundreds of these interviews and learned long ago not to show her cards too early. Jerome's response was immediate and smooth. "I don't know anything about any duffel bag. It's not mine. Someone must have put it there. Someone put a bag containing federal property and multiple forms of identification with your photo in your trunk without your knowledge. I'm telling you, I've never seen that bag before today. If there's something illegal in my car, I'm a victim here, not a suspect." It was a bold play, and under different circumstances, it might have worked. Illegal search, evidence potentially inadmissible, a calm, well-dressed professional claiming he had been set up. Defense attorneys had built entire careers on less. But Reeves had been doing this job for 18 years, and something about Jerome Caldwell's calm didn't sit right with her. It wasn't the composure of an innocent man facing false accusations. It was something else, something practiced, something that suggested familiarity with situations exactly like this one. She keyed a command into her tablet and waited. Seconds later, a different set of information appeared on her screen, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Jerome Marcus Caldwell," she read aloud, "is a legal name change filed in February 2020 under sealed court order in the state of Louisiana. Previous legal name, Maurice Lamont Brooks. Born June 17, 1981, in Baton Rouge." Jerome's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes flickered. The first crack in the armor. "Maurice Lamont Brooks," Reeves continued, "has a sealed juvenile record in Louisiana for an offense involving contact with a minor. He has adult convictions in Texas that were pled down as part of a cooperative agreement. He has multiple aliases flagged by the Department of Homeland Security in Nevada, Georgia, and Ohio. He was on supervised release until 2019 for offenses that required registration on a federal database." The words landed like hammer blows, each one stripping away another layer of the fiction that Jerome had constructed. The calm professional driving home from work, the victim of racial profiling, The innocent man whose rights had been violated, all of it dissolving under the weight of a history he had worked very hard to bury. "Your new identity wasn't fake," Reeves said, leaning forward slightly. "It was legally changed through proper channels, which is why it didn't trigger any flags when Officer Trent ran your plates. But that only works if nobody looks too closely. And right now, we're looking very closely." For the first time since the traffic stop began, something in Jerome's composure cracked. It was subtle, a tightening around the jaw, a barely perceptible shift in breathing. But Reeves caught it, and she knew what it meant. The game was changing. "I want a lawyer," Jerome said, the words coming out clipped and hard. "I'm not saying anything else without legal representation." That was his right, and Reeves respected it. She stood, gathered her tablet, and moved toward the door. But before she left, she paused and looked back at the man sitting at the metal table. "The USB drives are being analyzed by the FBI's cybercrimes unit right now," she said. "Whatever you think you can hide, whatever you think you can explain away, the truth is already coming out. And this time, there's no plea deal that's going to save you." The door closed behind her, and Jerome Caldwell sat alone in the fluorescent brightness, surrounded by the evidence of a life he had spent years carefully concealing. The traffic stop that should have been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, another story of harassment to add to his mental catalog of injustices, had instead pulled back a curtain he had believed was permanently closed. Outside the interrogation room, Reeves found Kevin Trent sitting on a bench in the hallway, his posture that of a man who had been hollowed out and was still trying to figure out what was left inside. He looked up when she approached, and the question in his eyes was obvious. "What did you find?" Reeves sat down beside him, close enough that her voice wouldn't carry. "His real name is Maurice Brooks. He's got a history that goes back decades. Offenses against minors, identity fraud, and based on what's in those folders, we're looking at something a lot bigger than one man's past mistakes." Trent absorbed this in silence. His hands were clasped between his knees, and he stared at the linoleum floor as if it contained answers to questions he wasn't sure how to ask. "I searched his car illegally," he said finally. "I made up the smell. I don't know, something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was off." "Your instincts were right, but the way I acted on them was wrong." Reeves didn't argue with that, couldn't argue with it, because Kevin Trent had violated the Constitution. He had profiled a man based on the color of his skin and then manufactured justification for a search he had no legal right to conduct. That was a fact, and no amount of what he had found could change it. And yet, the folders in that duffel bag contained the faces of children. The USB drives were already revealing encrypted communications with victims across multiple states. The sealed case marked as federal property was being opened by agents who had been tracking a pattern of predatory behavior for months without being able to identify a suspect. Kevin Trent had done something wrong, and in doing so, he had stumbled into something that might save lives. The moral arithmetic of that equation refused to balance neatly, no matter how many times you tried to solve it. "What happens now?" Trent asked. "Now," Reeves said, standing and straightening her uniform, "we let the feds take over, and we wait for the internet to lose its mind." The video hit Twitter at 5:48 p.m. Pacific Time. Uploaded by Patricia Nguyen with a caption that read, "Sterling Heights police just harassed another black man for driving while black. This has to stop." End racial profiling. Our justice for Jerome. By 7 p.m., it had been viewed 400,000 times. By 9 p.m., the view count had passed 1.2 million. By midnight, Sterling Heights and Officer Trent were trending nationally. The hashtag #Justice for Jerome climbing the ranks of social media discourse, alongside clips from the video that had been spliced, filtered, soundtracked with dramatic music, and shared across every platform imaginable. The video was 93 seconds long. It showed the confrontation from Patricia's perspective, starting when Jerome stepped out of his car with his hands raised and his phone held up to record. It captured Trent's aggressive posture, his barked commands, his visible hostility toward a man who had done nothing but assert his constitutional rights. It ended just as Trent walked toward the trunk, cutting off before any discovery, before any change in the narrative's trajectory. That 93 seconds was all the internet needed. The comments wrote themselves. "Here we go again. Driving while black in America. How many more times do we have to watch this?" Fire Officer Trent now. The outrage was immediate, overwhelming, and utterly certain of its own righteousness. People who had seen hundreds of similar videos recognized the pattern instantly. Black man, white cop, wealthy neighborhood. The story practically told itself. National news picked it up by the 11 o'clock broadcasts. The anchor on one network described it as yet another troubling incident of apparent racial profiling in suburban America. A civil rights attorney appeared in a split screen to explain the legal implications of warrantless searches. The mayor's office released a statement expressing concern and promising a thorough investigation. Nobody mentioned the duffel bag. Nobody mentioned the folders. Nobody mentioned the fact that Jerome Caldwell was currently sitting in federal custody while FBI agents pulled apart a digital trail that stretched across half a dozen states. That information was still locked behind confidentiality protocols in ongoing investigation parameters. All the public had was the 93-second clip, and that clip told a story that felt familiar, righteous, and complete. Kevin Trent learned about the video when his phone started buzzing with calls he didn't recognize. By the time he drove home, someone had posted his home address on a public forum. By morning, his wife Ellen had received over 200 messages on Facebook, ranging from expressions of sympathy to detailed descriptions of violence that their family deserved to experience. The school called at 9:15 a.m. to inform Ellen that their two children would need to be picked up early due to safety concerns. Someone had made a threat, or possibly multiple someones, and the administration felt it was best if the Trent kids weren't on campus until the situation calmed down. Kevin sat in his living room with the curtains drawn, watching his phone light up with notifications he was afraid to open. His wife sat across from him, their children doing homework in a bedroom they weren't supposed to leave. The house that had been their home for 8 years suddenly felt like a target, the walls providing shelter but not safety. "What did you do?" Ellen asked, her voice carrying the exhaustion of a woman who had been awakened at 3 a.m. by death threats and hadn't been able to fall back asleep. Kevin told her. All of it. The feeling that something was wrong, the decision to pull the car over, the illegal search, the discovery in the trunk, the contents of those folders. The look on Jerome Caldwell's face when the cuffs clicked shut. Ellen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, processing a story that refused to fit neatly into any category she recognized. "So you broke the law," she said finally, "and in doing so, you caught a predator." Kevin nodded. "And now everyone thinks you're a racist monster." Another nod. "And they're probably not going to find out the truth until it's too late to matter." That was the part Kevin couldn't stop thinking about. The truth was working its way through federal databases and investigative protocols. Eventually it would emerge. Eventually the full picture would become visible. But the outrage cycle didn't operate on the timeline of careful investigation. The outrage cycle operated on the timeline of emotion, and right now the emotion was fury directed squarely at him. The protesters gathered outside the Sterling Heights Police Department the following morning. 200 people at first, growing to 500 by afternoon. They carried signs with Kevin's badge number, his name, his face. They chanted slogans about accountability and justice. They demanded his termination, his prosecution, his removal from a society that they believed he had proved himself unworthy to inhabit. Inside the building, the mood was controlled panic. The body camera footage hadn't been publicly released. The evidence from the trunk was still being processed. The department's communications officer had nothing to say because there was nothing she could say without compromising an active federal investigation. The chief met with Kevin briefly, a conversation conducted in lowered voices behind a closed door. "You're going on administrative leave," he said, the words carrying the weight of inevitability. "No pay, no statement, no comment. We can't defend what you did, even if what you found turns out to be what we think it is." Kevin didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. He had violated policy. He had violated law. The fact that his violation had revealed something monstrous didn't change the nature of the violation itself. He cleaned out his locker that afternoon, moving through the station like a ghost. Officers he had worked with for years avoided eye contact. Nobody knew what to say, and so they said nothing, which was perhaps its own kind of verdict. The silence in his cruiser on the drive home felt different than it had on any other day. This time, there was no shift waiting for him tomorrow, no schedule to follow, no routine to anchor him. There was only the uncertainty of what came next, and the knowledge that his name had become a symbol of something he had never intended it to represent. If you're still watching, I want you to think about this moment. Think about what it feels like to be condemned before the facts are known. Think about the gap between what actually happened and what a 93-second video seems to show. Because the story you've been told so far isn't the whole story. Not even close. And what happens next is going to complicate everything you thought you understood about victims and villains, about instinct and evidence, about the stories we tell ourselves when we think we know who deserves our outrage. The full body camera footage was released 4 days after the traffic stop, not because the department wanted to release it, but because the pressure had become impossible to withstand. The mayor demanded transparency, the protesters demanded accountability, the lawyers demanded documentation. And so, under the weight of public fury, the complete recording was made available to the press. What people expected to see was a confirmation of what they already believed: the aggressive cop, the compliant victim, the constitutional violation captured in merciless detail. The first few minutes of the footage delivered exactly that: Kevin Trent's hostile approach, his curt demands, his manufactured claim of smelling something suspicious, the clearly illegal decision to open the door and search the vehicle without consent. But the footage kept playing past the point where Patricia Nguyen's phone video had ended. It kept playing through Kevin's discovery of the duffel bag, through his stunned reaction as he pulled out the USB drives and the fake identifications. It kept playing through his hushed call for a supervisor, through Sergeant Reeves's arrival and her review of the manila folders. The camera captured Kevin's face when he realized what he was looking at. The audio captured his breathing, the sharp intake of air that accompanied his understanding that he had stumbled into something far darker than a routine traffic stop. And the timestamp in the corner of the screen showed exactly how long he had stood there, frozen, as the weight of his discovery settled onto his shoulders. Accompanying the footage was a joint statement from the FBI and the Department of Justice. It confirmed that Jerome Marcus Caldwell, born Maurice Lamont Brooks, had been the subject of an ongoing multi-state investigation into child exploitation and trafficking. The traffic stop had not initiated that investigation, but it had accelerated it dramatically. Evidence recovered from the vehicle had been matched to open cases in 5 states. Digital forensics had established connections between Caldwell and a network of individuals engaged in the production and distribution of illegal content involving minors. The statement was clinical, bureaucratic, and devastating. The response was not what anyone had predicted. Some media outlets immediately reversed course, issuing corrections and updates that acknowledged the new information. Others doubled down on their original coverage, arguing that the illegal search remained a constitutional violation regardless of what it had uncovered. Commentators who had demanded Kevin's termination now faced the uncomfortable task of explaining how they felt about a cop who had broken the rules to catch a predator. Social media fractured along familiar lines. Some users deleted their previous post without acknowledgement, quietly scrubbing their timelines of the outrage they had expressed days earlier. Others reframed their arguments, emphasizing that Kevin's actions had still been wrong, even if the outcome had been unexpectedly positive. And a substantial number refused to believe the new narrative at all, dismissing the FBI statement as a cover-up designed to protect a racist cop. The hashtag #Justice for Jerome didn't disappear. It evolved. Some people continued using it to demand accountability for Kevin's actions. Others repurposed it ironically, questioning how justice could be achieved for a man who had allegedly victimized children. The discourse became a tangled mess of competing narratives, each one claiming exclusive access to the truth. Inside the Sterling Heights Police Department, the atmosphere shifted in ways that were subtle but significant. Kevin was still on administrative leave, still officially under investigation for policy violations, still carrying the weight of what he had done. But the conversations about him had changed. Officers who had avoided him the week before now made a point of stopping by his house to check in. The chief's private communications suggested that reinstatement was likely, though it would come with conditions and without fanfare. Kevin sat in his living room the evening after the footage release, watching the news coverage cycle through its latest iterations. His wife sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee, her presence the only thing keeping him anchored as the world argued about who he was and what he had done. "They're calling you a hero on some channels," Ellen said quietly. "I'm not a hero. They're calling you a racist on others. I'm not sure what I am anymore." The honest answer, the one Kevin couldn't say out loud because it sounded too simple and too complicated at the same time, was that he was both and neither. He had profiled a man because of his skin color. That was true. He had violated that man's constitutional rights based on nothing more than prejudice and a manufactured excuse. That was also true, and in doing so, he had uncovered evidence that might protect children from a predator who had spent years perfecting his camouflage. The math didn't balance. It wasn't supposed to. Real life rarely offered the clean moral resolutions that narratives demanded. Kevin had done something wrong, and something important had resulted from it. Both facts existed simultaneously, neither one canceling out the other. The federal indictment was unsealed 3 weeks later. Jerome Marcus Caldwell, also known as Maurice Lamont Brooks, faced 13 counts, including possession of material depicting child sexual abuse, identity fraud, conspiracy to exploit minors across state lines, and interstate trafficking with intent to distribute. The evidence was overwhelming. The aliases had been traced to online accounts used to contact and groom victims. The USB drives contained years of encrypted communications and files that made investigators physically ill to review. The sealed DOJ case in the trunk had been part of a pattern, evidence that Caldwell had been collecting materials related to ongoing investigations, possibly to stay ahead of authorities, possibly for reasons even darker. The names in those manila folders began to correlate with missing persons cases. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to suggest that Caldwell's activities hadn't been limited to digital exploitation. Enough to launch a victim identification and recovery effort that would span months and involve agencies from half a dozen states. Kevin Trent learned about the indictment while sitting in his attorney's office, preparing the paperwork for his own legal action. He was suing 3 national news networks, 4 local television stations, 2 print newspapers, and 7 individual journalists for defamation. His lawyers weren't arguing that the search had been legal. Everyone acknowledged it hadn't been. They were arguing that the coverage had been deliberately misleading, that editors had possessed the full body camera footage before choosing to air only the portion that supported a predetermined narrative, that the rush to judgment had caused quantifiable harm to Kevin and his family. 3 of the defendants settled before the case went to trial. Undisclosed amounts, no admissions of wrongdoing, confidentiality agreements that prevented Kevin from discussing the terms. The money was substantial enough to fund a new beginning, though Kevin hadn't yet decided what that beginning would look like. He returned to the department 5 weeks after the traffic stop, reinstated with full back pay and a formal reprimand in his personnel file. The reinstatement came with no ceremony, no welcome back celebration, no public acknowledgement. He walked into the station on a Wednesday morning, collected his equipment from the armory, and began his shift as if the previous month had been an unpleasant dream. But everything was different now. The other officers looked at him differently, some with respect, some with resentment, some with a complicated mixture that defied easy categorization. The civilians he encountered during his patrols sometimes recognized his face from the news coverage, and their reactions ranged from hostile to grateful, depending on which version of the story they had chosen to believe. Kevin filed for early retirement 11 weeks after his reinstatement. The decision surprised no one who knew him, least of all himself. The job he had once loved had become something he could no longer recognize. Every traffic stop carried the weight of what had happened in Sterling Heights. Every interaction with a citizen of color felt freighted with assumptions and expectations that he couldn't escape no matter how professional his conduct. He was not pushed out. He chose to leave. But the choice was made within constraints that made it feel less like a decision and more like an inevitability. His final shift ended without incident. He drove his cruiser back to the station, turned in his equipment for the last time, and walked to his personal vehicle in the parking lot. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, and for a moment, Kevin stood beside his car and let himself feel the weight of everything that had brought him to this point. 12 years on the force. Commendations and complaints, shifts that blurred together, and moments that stood out with crystalline clarity. And now, an ending that felt neither triumphant nor tragic, just final. He drove home to Ellen and their children, to a house that no longer felt like a target, but didn't quite feel like home either. The money from the settlements would allow them to relocate, to start fresh somewhere that didn't know his name or his face or the story that had been told about him. But Kevin knew that the story would follow him. It would live in internet archives and news databases, a permanent record of a moment that had been captured and distributed and interpreted in ways that bore only partial resemblance to what had actually happened. He would always be the cop from that video, depending on who was watching and what they had chosen to believe. This is where a lot of stories would end. The case closed, the bad guy caught, the flawed hero riding off into whatever passes for a sunset in the modern world. But the real ending is more complicated than that, because the real ending involves questions that don't have answers and consequences that don't resolve cleanly. Think about this. What if Kevin Trent hadn't searched that car? What if, confronted with Jerome Caldwell's refusal to consent, he had followed proper procedure, issued a warning for the imaginary lane change, and sent the Mercedes on its way? The duffel bag would have remained unopened. The USB drives would have continued collecting data. The manila folders would have accumulated more names. And Maurice Lamont Brooks would have continued operating in the shadows, protected by legal safeguards designed to prevent exactly the kind of violation that Kevin had committed. That thought haunts everyone involved in this case. It haunts the FBI agents who spent months building a circumstantial case that might never have led to an arrest. It haunts Sergeant Reeves, who watched a colleague violate the law and inadvertently save lives. It haunts the parents of children whose names appeared in those folders, children who might have become victims if Kevin Trent had followed the rules. And it haunts the activists and commentators who spent the first week of this story demanding Kevin's destruction, only to learn that the man they were defending was a monster in careful disguise. Some of them walked back their positions. Some of them issued quiet corrections, acknowledging that new information had complicated their initial assessments. But many of them simply moved on to the next outrage, the next video, the next story that seemed clear enough to require immediate judgment and unambiguous condemnation. The court of public opinion doesn't issue retractions. It doesn't apologize for verdicts rendered in haste. It just keeps moving, consuming content, and producing judgments at a pace that makes careful analysis impossible and perhaps irrelevant. So what are we supposed to learn from all of this? That's not a rhetorical question. I'm genuinely asking, because this story doesn't offer easy lessons or comfortable conclusions. Kevin Trent violated the Constitution. That's a fact. He profiled a black man based on nothing more than skin color and neighborhood demographics. That's also a fact. And his violation uncovered a predator who had been exploiting legal loopholes to avoid detection for years. That's a fact too. Some people will use this story to argue that cops should be given more latitude to follow their instincts, that constitutional protections should be weakened in the name of public safety. That's one interpretation, and it's terrifying in its implications. Because for every Maurice Lamont Brooks hiding behind a legal name change, there are thousands of innocent people whose rights deserve protection from exactly the kind of fishing expedition that Kevin Trent conducted. Other people will use this story to argue that the original outrage was justified, that Kevin's actions were wrong regardless of what they uncovered, that the ends can never justify the means. That's another interpretation, and it's also incomplete, because it ignores the faces in those manila folders, the children whose protection might have been delayed by months or years if Kevin had followed proper procedure. The truth, as usual, is messier than either interpretation allows. We live in a world where procedures exist for good reasons, where constitutional protections prevent tyranny at the cost of sometimes protecting the guilty. We also live in a world where predators exploit those same protections, where monsters hide behind the safeguards that civilized society has constructed. And we live in a world where 93 seconds of video can destroy a man's life before anyone knows the full story, where the gap between viral outrage and verified truth can stretch for days or weeks while reputations are shattered and families are threatened, where the same platforms that can expose injustice can also perpetuate it, where the democratization of judgment has created a world where everyone is a jury and no one waits for evidence. I'm not going to tell you what to think about Kevin Trent. I'm not going to tell you he was a hero or a villain or some comfortable combination of both. That's not my job. My job is to tell you what happened as completely as I can and let you wrestle with the implications yourself. But I will ask you this. The next time a video shows up in your feed, the next time a story breaks that seems to confirm everything you already believe about cops or victims or the nature of American injustice, will you wait? Will you hold your judgment for the hours or days it might take for the full picture to emerge? Will you resist the urge to share, to comment, to add your voice to the chorus of condemnation before you know whether that condemnation is warranted? Because the answer to those questions determines what kind of world we're building. A world where patience is valued and truth is pursued, or a world where the speed of outrage outpaces the speed of understanding. Kevin Trent is gone now, retired to a life that bears no resemblance to the one he expected when he first pinned on a badge. Maurice Lamont Brooks is awaiting trial, facing decades in federal prison if convicted on all counts. Patricia Nguyen still lives on her street in Sterling Heights, though she's stopped sharing videos of traffic stops. The teenager on the bicycle grew up to be something else entirely, shaped in ways both visible and invisible by the afternoon he spent watching a story unfold that refused to be simple. And somewhere in the digital archives, a 93-second video continues to exist, telling a partial truth that millions of people believed was complete. If you've stayed with this story until the end, I have one final request. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, not because I want the numbers, but because these are the kinds of stories that deserve attention. The complicated ones, the ones that don't fit neatly into pre-existing narratives, the ones that force us to sit with our discomfort rather than resolving it through easy condemnation or celebration. And leave a comment below. Not about whether Kevin was right or wrong, but about how we got to a world where that question became so difficult to answer. Because the real story here isn't about one traffic stop in one suburb on one afternoon. It's about all of us, and the systems we've built, and the judgments we make, and the cost of getting it wrong. I'll see you in the next one. Stay thoughtful out there.